All right, now I'll call up David Sutton, our final supervisor, to introduce Jess Urwin.
Thanks, Tom. When my colleagues and I in the military history section were putting together the proposal for this project, one of the main concerns we had was that there mightn't be enough source material, or it'd be difficult to find or really tease out some of the most important aspects of what we wanted our summer scholar to study. Jess has, as her supervisor, it's been a delight, and I've watched it in awe as she's uncovered an incredible amount of material with a lot of skill and a lot of professionalism, and very well done. I'm very excited to present her paper, for her to present her paper, I should say. I can if you like. So Jess has recently completed her double degree at the Australian National University, double in Arts and International Relations, and next week, I believe, is going to be beginning her honours year where she's studying the colonial implications of the British nuclear testing at Maralinga in South Australia. And it's my delight to welcome her up to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was very lovely, David. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out in your morning to come and watch us speak. So R.A.F Coastal Command played a significant yet largely underrepresented role in the Second World War. Unfamiliar to most, this presentation will hopefully shed some light on the experiences of those Australian aircrew who did serve in this command. In order to unpack the experiences of those who served, it's first important to establish what exactly Coastal Command did, and therefore what the Australians who served also did. I'll then address the key misconceptions that have come to be associated with Coastal Command, before finally looking at the experiences of those who served. As I looked through the literature, three main themes emerged, and so for the sake of coherence, I'll address their experiences within those three themes, being the weather, the length of their sorties, and anticipatory fear. So at the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, the Royal Air Force had three offensive operational commands, and these were bomber, fighter, and coastal commands. The more famous of these, bomber and fighter, operated to their namesakes. Bomber Command were famous for their bombing raids over Nazi-occupied territory, and the fighter command's aircrew were famous for their fighter raids protecting Britain in the Battle of Britain. Unfortunately for Coastal Command, they're relatively unknown, but the aircrew operating within this command undertook numerous jobs. This included, but is not limited to, escorting Allied shipping columns, anti-shipping and anti-submarine patrols, transporting important passengers, delivering vital supply to damaged aircraft, air-to-sea rescue, reconnaissance, and even assisting in the preparations for D-Day. As for the Australians who served within Coastal Command, as part of Australia's contribution to the Allied war effort, many aircrews signed up to the RAF. As a result, there were Australians scattered throughout Coastal Command. Due to the fact that most of them went through the Empire Air Training Scheme, it's hard to know the exact numbers as they were distributed throughout the various commands. Having said this, there was an already existent Royal Australian Air Force Squadron who moved over to Pembroke Dock in Wales in order to operate within Coastal Command, and this was Number 10 Squadron. Number 10 Squadron became relatively famous throughout Coastal Command, and on Anzac Day of 1942, a second Australian squadron was formed from this. This was 461 Squadron. There was another squadron who I should mention that was predominantly Australian, and that was 455. They were the Anzac Strike Wing, but they did a lot of anti-shipping bombing, so I won't focus so much on them today. By 1942, Pembroke Dock, it's just here, was known as an Australian home away from home due to the fact that both of these Australian squadrons were operating out of here. They would fly their Sunderlands from Pembroke Dock for 10 to 15 hours out over the Bay of Biscay looking for snorkels. These two squadrons were particularly important for understanding the experiences of Coastal Command, and this is due largely to the aircraft that they were operating. The short Sunderland flying boat was operated by both 10 and 461, and it was an exceptionally large aircraft. Their wingspan is actually 3 metres larger than that of our Lancaster bomber G for George in Anzac Hall. These planes were considered fantastic for fighting German U-boats, as their sheer size meant that it was able to fly further and far longer than most other operational RAF aircraft. The bulk of it also meant that it could withstand significant turbulence, which was vital because these planes operated at the low altitude of approximately 1,000 feet in order to spot U-boats. This meant that a snorkel presented a fleeting opportunity to strike for these guys. Inside a short Sunderland, you had 11 to 13 men. Now, this meant that the responsibility of 11 men was exceptionally large for a pilot of a Sunderland. Every crew left a significant hole in the lives of many. Coastal Command's relative anonymity has ensured few know what they did and therefore question whether their role was particularly necessary in the war. Despite this, following the war, Winston Churchill actually admitted in his book, The Second World War, that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. When you crunch the numbers, Coastal Command was vital to the Battle of the Atlantic. Between January and May 1941 alone, Nazi Germany was responsible for sinking 2 million tonnes of Allied shipping. In 1942, a further 6 million tonnes were lost. While the Royal Navy was tasked with attempting to avoid these losses, shown here in the red dots, Coastal Command provided vital air support to their efforts. This meant that Coastal Command was responsible for sinking 366 German ships and 165 U-boats, damaging a further 134 ships and 107 U-boats. In total, this amounted to over 1 million tonnes of German shipping. These losses scared the Germans. The German admiral and commander of the submarines, Karl Dönitz, warned Hitler in 1943 that the involvement of the Air Force in the Battle of the Atlantic was contributing significantly to the present crisis in submarine warfare. As a result, the German Navy was required to change their tactics. German U-boats were encouraged to make the Atlantic Passage completely submerged. German Junker 88 fighter bombers were deployed in order to protect the wolf packs against Sunderlands. And finally, U-boats were even encouraged to stay surfaced and fight back with anti-aircraft fire. Coastal Command continued to engage U-boats, contributing to many U-boat kills and assisting in the hindrance of German naval tactics. But unfortunately for Coastal Command, a lot of these successes are relatively intangible. Despite the fact that Coastal Command clearly had a large role to play in the war, their efforts are certainly underrepresented and as a result often misconceived. There are a number of myths associated with Coastal Command that I'm hoping to dispel today by looking at the experiences of the aircrew. The sheer length and monotony of the sorties of coastal crew have led the historiography towards the assumption that this was an unimportant job, merely defensive in nature, ranking third place to fighter and bomber commands. Cementing Coastal Command in this position of third place is the historical desire to quantify success. Unfortunately for Coastal Command, the sheer numbers do not fully represent the amount of work put in by these squadrons. Take RAF Squadron number 10, for example. They flew over 3 million operational miles throughout the war on over 2,500 operations, but they were only attributed with 6 U-boat kills. As a result of history's obsession with material success, Coastal Command remains relatively unrewarded for their contribution to the altering of German naval tactics and their mere presence over the Atlantic. Furthering this, Coastal Command apparently lacks glamour, according to the historiography, and recognition for effort doesn't quite stand up to awards for distinguished flying and the valour of serving in bomber and fighter commands. When British politician Archibald Sinclair wrote to congratulate No. 10 Squadron for their U-boat kills, he actually stated that the work of Coastal Command may at times have appeared unspectacular by comparison with other commands of the Royal Air Force. And such sentiment is scattered throughout the historiography. The RAF official historian, John Harrington, wrote in 1954 that Coastal Command was overlooked as the eyes of the world were still fixed on the Homeric air battles being waged over southeast England. This, despite the loss of 5,863 coastal aircrew on operations. While the work of Coastal Command has been deemed subsidiary, defensive, unspectacular, monotonous, fractional, supplementary, unglamorous, and unimportant by a variety of sources, this is not the case. Exploring the private records of those who served has shown that RAF Coastal Command has a proud history and one that deserves to be told. But what was it like to serve in RAF Coastal Command? In order to contextualise a sortie of Coastal Command, I'll tell the short yet spectacular story of Sunderland EJ134, or N for Nuts of 461 Squadron. The remains we have in the collection out at Mitchell, and I was lucky enough to view and take photographs of. On the 2nd of June 1943, the aircrew of N for Nuts of 461 Squadron were preparing for a patrol across the Bay of Biscay. Delayed significantly owing to the weather, their Sunderland took off at 1300 hours for what they assumed would be your routine anti-submarine patrol. At 1900 hours, after 6 hours of flying, 8 aircraft were spotted on the starboard beam of the Sunderland. Flight Lieutenant Walker attempted to take cover in cloud while turning back for base. But unfortunately for the crew of N for Nuts, the 8 aircraft were German Junker 88 fighter bombers, and within 5 minutes of the sighting, they'd attacked. The Sunderland received significant damage. Fire spread throughout the cockpit. The navigator and the wireless operator were wounded by shrapnel. Exceptional defensive fire from the Sunderland's gunners meant that after an hour of aerial fighting, there were only 2 of the 8 Junkers left. The final offensive aircraft abandoned their efforts an hour after the initial attack. Walker headed for home, but this required making it 300 miles back to base with a wounded crew and an even more severely wounded plane. On returning to England, the Sunderland was abandoned on a public beach in Cornwall, having lost its final engines on the down throttle. By morning, the severely damaged N for Nuts was badly broken up and scattered across the beach. The crew's engineer, Pilot Officer Miles of the RAF, was mortally wounded. 2 months later, on the 13th of August 1943, on a similar anti-submarine patrol, the same crew flew to their deaths after once again being attacked by a group of Ju-88s. Their plane was never found, and the crew was officially presumed dead in 1944. The crews of Coastal Command had to be ready for anything. They had to face the weather, the possibility of being wounded hours away from base, and the anxiety of potentially coming across further enemy fire on the long journey home. This remains largely unique to Coastal Command due to the sheer length and unpredictability of their operations. The story of N for Nuts encapsulates the experience of serving in Coastal Command, but what themes dictate this experience? As highlighted by the delay of N for Nuts in embarking on their sortie, Coastal Command was largely at the mercy of the weather. While the weather was considered an excuse of coastal crew not to fly by RAF neurologist J. Simmons, it was a serious obstacle, and 2,317 coastal aircrew died simply in flying accidents. For many coastal crew, the weather presented a unique enemy, and it often presented danger to them more than it did to those of other commands. Whether operations would be conducted was dictated by the weather. The diary of Flight Sergeant Alan Talbot notes him being awakened at 4 a.m. for his operation, only to have poor weather and insufficient meteorological reports postpone takeoff multiple times until 12:30 p.m., 8 hours later, when the Sunderland took flight. This was a frequent occurrence and added countless hours onto what were already incredibly long sorties. The weather similarly affected landing, and many anxious hours were flown out across the Bay of Biscay, not knowing what the weather would be like on return. An unnamed coastal aircrew member admitted, "If everyone knew when we went out that the weather would be fine when we came back, all would be well. It's the fear of the weather that gets people down in our job." Air sickness was an inevitable side effect of this terrible weather. And while aircrew of all RAF commands would have suffered air sickness, the Sunderland's low operating altitude exacerbated this in coastal crew. Despite the size of the Sunderland, it was described as having been tossed like a toy in severe weather fronts, incredibly common over the Atlantic. Low altitudes worsened flying conditions as there was an inability to escape the weather. Many crashes resulted from the weather, with Flight Lieutenant of 461 Squadron, Ivan Southall, identifying the weather as a major enemy, as when the Germans were gone, the weather persisted. This comes up a number of times in the experiences of coastal crew. For example, Richardson recalls a night's flying where he wished the plane would crash to end the severe turbulence. "I've never been so sick in all my life," he says. "I just laid down in my bunk. I hope the damn thing crashed, that's how bad it was." In fact, ground crews working on Sunderlands made money off of the sickness of aircrew. They charged £5 to every member of the crew unable to clean up after themselves. Many an embarrassed aircrew trudged back to the Sunderland following debrief in order to save both their wages and their dignity. These experiences draw into question the idea that Coastal Command undertook simple jobs, avoiding danger unlike those of bomber and fighter commands. The endurance of consistently turbulent and dicey weather demonstrated persistence and discipline, in which many coastal crew took significant pride. It was through their unique experiences that Coastal Command aircrew separated their experiences from those of other commands. As Flight Lieutenant Southall articulated, when the fighter aircraft retired to their bases and the fighter pilots put their feet up to the stove, the Sunderland crews still went out into conditions which frightened them. Similarly, bomber crews flew at high altitudes with a direct target in mind. For Coastal Command, one didn't hunt for U-boats at a height of 10,000 feet above the weather, one hunted for U-boats beneath the cloud base, in the weather. The exceptional stamina of the short Sunderland meant that Coastal Command crews of 10 and 461 squadrons, as well as many others across the command, were in the air for upwards of 10 hours at a time. While many of the crew rotated, there was only one navigator, therefore he was unable to be relieved. He was forced to stare at the horizon for hours upon end. Sorties could last up to 16 hours if weather hindered landing, and many a Sunderland came in with very little fuel to spare. Squadron leader Russell Baird of 10 admits seeing navigators on his crew break down. "I've seen him crying with his captain," he recalls. "He's saying, 'I just can't do any more. I can't go anymore.'" Taking off in the early hours of the morning and landing in the dark, the aircrew of Coastal Command tell harrowing stories of being unable to see or even blink after hours upon hours of staring at the horizon. Others recall hallucination. Warrant Officer William Darcy of 10 Squadron claims his main hallucination was little men riding bicycles over the waves. The endurance of sorties of this length was relatively unique to Coastal Command, and their operations were frequently double that of other commands. Frederick Hunter of No. 10 Bomber Squadron wrote home to his mother in 1941, talking of how 7 hours was too long to be on a plane. In fact, 4 hours proved too long. But the crew of a Sunderland flew 3 times that length, all of which was over the ocean, scanning for an enemy that may or may not appear. Despite the fact that the tasks of Coastal Command were demanding and exhausting, the tour of a Coastal Command airman was not to be considered done by the RAF until they had completed 1,000 flying hours, 5 times longer than most other aircrew. This contributes to the assumption that the work of Coastal Command was not as demanding as other commands, careers amounting to thousands rather than hundreds of hours. But the mental and physical exhaustion that these sorties took on those who served should not be underestimated. Coastal crews were described as having flown on and on and on until they vanished forever into the grey Atlantic wastes or reached a state of nervous exhaustion. Squadron leader Russell Baird discussed how all of 10 Squadron was exhausted as they were flying 4 days out of 6. When asked just how tired he was at the end of operations, Warrant Officer William Darcy of No. 10 admitted, "I've never been so exhausted, so tired that I couldn't close my eyes." This exhaustion wasn't exclusively physical. The mental toll taken on the aircrew was significant as well. Flight Lieutenant Ivan Southall said that after 700 operational hours, "I know I was getting a bit irritable. You reach a point where you've had enough, and the safest place for you to be, for everybody, is out." Despite this, the Sunderland's abilities brought great pride to the aircrew that flew them, irrespective of the fact that their specifications led them to have work that was particularly demanding. Long sorties undoubtedly took their toll, though the crews of Coastal Command were incredibly proud of their work. Patience was a virtue particular to those of Coastal Command. And in the RAF official history, John Harrington draws this out by stating that those by temperament impatient to engage in more obviously active combat chose fighter or bomber command, with the result that to Coastal Command came chiefly pilots and navigators of high intellectual capabilities. The nature of the work of Coastal Command squadrons searching for U-boats and shipping meant that the whereabouts of the enemy was rarely definitively known. This anticipation played on the minds of many. One would fly out from Pembroke Dock, patrolling for 15 hours without even spotting a snorkel. As Flight Lieutenant Southall put it, they still had to look for the U-boats, whether the U-boats were there or not. Or like N for nuts, one would fly out for 5, 6, 7 hours before encountering the enemy in an unexpected form, such as a fighter or a ship. Compare this to the definitive role of other commands who had specific targets and timeframes. The anticipation and inability to know where or when the enemy would be encountered add a unique element to the sorties of Coastal Command aircrew. And for the aircrew of Coastal, when things were happening, you forgot yourself as a person and got on with the job. When things were not happening, everyone was a lot harder to get along with, and suspense was agony. For the most part, not much was happening, but the crews had to be ready for anything. The anticipation meant that coastal crews had to demonstrate unparalleled discipline and endurance. As articulated by author Martin Baumann, to keep an unblinking and vigilant lookout over what seems like an illimitable stretch of sea demands physical and mental endurance of a high order. Though this had its side effects, challenging the accepted view that Coastal Command was dictated by monotony and irrelevance. Number 10 Squadron Leader Russell Baird admits he was dead scared all the time. Despite this, the crew boarded their Sunderlands understanding that every patrol added to their contribution to the war and was a necessary sacrifice. Unfortunately, the historiography surrounding Air Force commands has fallen relatively quietly on the experiences of Coastal Command. Irrespective of the relative anonymity of Coastal Command's experience of the Second World War, those who served wield the misconceptions with which they have been ascribed as a way of demonstrating the gallantry with which they served. They understood that their work was vital, and Squadron Leader Baird described the piloting of a Sunderland as a prize job. While Coastal Command has been ascribed with lacking the glamour of other commands, the Australian aircrew who served were proud of their involvement in the war. By way of conclusion, I wanted to leave you with this verse written by British Wing Commander Tony Spooner. It encapsulates the themes of this presentation, highlighting the misconceptions ascribed to Coastal Command while noting the pride with which their aircrew operated. Fighters or bombers, his friends used to ask. Coastal, he said, his face a tired mask. Though not in the spotlight where others may bask, we've a tough job to do, and I'm proud of the task.
Thank you, Jess. That was excellent. Very engaging presentation. Do we have any questions for Jess?
Yes.
Got one down the front, please, Carl.
Jess, I understand the crews for 10 Squadron actually went over before the war to pick up the Sunderlands, and they basically, 10 Squadron stayed there.
Yeah.
Did it stay for the whole period of the war?
Yep, they stayed from basically, yeah, you're right. What happened was they went over to pick up their new planes, and Menzies, or whoever, I think it was Menzies, said, well, oh, you're already there, you might as well stay. They stayed at Pembroke Dock, and they did come back at the end of the war, but they served the whole war, as did, I'm fairly sure, once 461 Squadron was established, they also stayed till the end of the war as well. Yeah.
So was there any push after the Japan had sort of invaded? Was there any push for them to be brought back to Australia?
I don't think so. I think, if anything, they moved not to Australia, but I know that there were a lot of Sunderlands serving in kind of the Asia-Pacific region and other places kind of following the war, as well as, I'm fairly sure Qantas usurped a few Sunderlands as commercial planes. There was a lot of hope that a lot of those pilots would become commercial pilots for Qantas following the war. Yeah.
Was there the germ of this in the First World War at all, or was the technology just too far away in the First World War?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but I know that the Sunderland was kind of regarded as one of the most kind of advanced and greatest flying boats of the Second World War. I don't think there was an equivalent in the First World War, so they were pretty well regarded by this point, and they had multiple, what are they called? Not editions, but the plain version of editions, models of Sunderlands kind of built throughout the war. Yeah.
Jess, that was fantastic. Thank you. You mentioned right at the start that Coastal Command did play a role on D-Day. Could you expand a little more on that and tell us about that?
Fantastic. So the approach is obviously to D-Day were incredibly important. So Coastal Command were actually responsible for stopping a German invasion. They did actually anticipate there would be a fleet of subs that would come and try and attack the Allied fleet, so they protected those. And I actually have a stat here. Only one U-boat successfully attacked the invasion fleet, but they also played a really significant role in the meteorological reporting before D-Day. So they handed down all the weather reporting, which encouraged Eisenhower to push it back a day as well. So they were quite vital in that regard.
I think it's important to realise that Sunderland was secondary to the possibly the Liberator and the Wellington bomber, and also just flying your routes, providing you were using radar with a dish radar, you're doing your job, because the submarine would have to snort then and use up its batteries. So the fact you didn't see a submarine doesn't necessarily mean you're not doing your job.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one thing the RAF had to kind of revise halfway through the war, was how they quantified success. So they started saying to those aircrew operating in Coastal Command, well, the fact that we're not seeing submarines means that your presence is having an impact on German naval tactics.
Yeah, 15 hours saw nothing. Wacko.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess. Peter Stanley, UNSW Canberra. That was terrific. To add to Roger's point about the purpose of Coastal Command sorties, of course, the crews didn't know that often they were sent out to cover the fact that the Enigma decrypts had told the Coastal Command or the Royal Navy where the U-boats were. But if the Sunderlands hadn't gone out, the Germans would have said, how did they know? So in lots of ways, some of those men, those 2,000 men who died in accidents, lost over the Atlantic, were giving their lives for a purpose, but it wasn't until 50 years later that anybody really understood why. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Jess. Let's thank Jess again.